what we're seeing with managed Kubernetes services right now. They are getting certifications for certain layers of compliance and stuff like that. So yeah, you're going to have to show that stuff to your auditors. And it's going to be the same thing, with if it's full serverless versus if it's a managed Kubernetes service offering. The cloud's going to have to be able to back that up a little bit in terms of compliance level security. And just like now, if you're in a particular environment where it's like, hey, sorry, they don't meet this compliance need or they can't give us this information, then that means some of your workloads will have to run on-prem. And if this whole serverless Kubernetes thing ends up being as big as I think it could be, it may be the easiest we've ever seen from shifting from one environment to another. Because you're not really shifting environments, which is good. You're just kind of shifting mindset and thought process in terms of what you're managing.
Welcome to another edition of Cloud Unfiltered. I am your host, Michael Chenitz, and today I have Michael Levan on. And I've had you. We chat all the time. But maybe tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Absolutely, yeah. So I pretty much focus on everything and anything in the Kubernetes and platform engineering space. I've written 4 books. I create content for pretty much everybody, speaking at conferences, podcasting, consulting, live training, literally everything and anything in the space.
Yeah, that's exactly why I have you on here today. So I think one of the things that we wanted to talk about is kind of this evolution of the containerization space, I should call it, and where you think we're going with it. So why don't you start off with what we're talking about here, and talk about some of these ideas.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're always kind of wondering what's next. Kubernetes, in 3 days will be 10 years old, right? And we're always kind of wondering, okay, what's kind of the next evolution thing here? And there was a lot of talk about WASM, which is obviously still a thing, but it needs to be orchestrated by something, right? So maybe that's Kubernetes, maybe that's something else. But one of the things that I've been really thinking about is this whole idea around serverless Kubernetes. And I don't know if anybody else is calling it that, but I'm calling it that. And this is, the G-Key autopilot. This is, Azure Container Apps. This is EKS Fargate profiles. Maybe even GCP Cloud Run falls into there because Cloud Run is actually running on Borg, believe it or not. Literally, it's running on Borg, which is really interesting within itself. So I think that's the next evolution, is this idea of just hitting an API. Because right now, even with managed Kubernetes services, we are abstracting the control plane. Still have to do stuff like, hopefully we're all doing it right, backing up etcd, encrypting it, updating the control plane, aka the Kubernetes version and all that stuff. But still those worker nodes where we're still kind of worried about in a sense. But I think the next evolution is now no longer worrying about those worker nodes and just worrying about the API that we're hitting, setting up proper scaling, right? So our resource optimization, our cost optimization to scale everything out, and really just letting whoever manage the rest.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because, it's funny. We started out with these bare metal servers and we just said, we're going to have 3 to 4 servers that kind of load balance things out. And you had these 3 or 4 node clusters, you had your web server, you had your database that might have another 3 or 4 nodes. And then you had, whatever else you might have there, load balancers, things like that were all hardware. Then we said, we're going to virtualize it all. And we're going to make things in these virtual containers. And then we were like, you know what, let's take that virtualization and break it down into containers more, and just have, just so you show the kernel and, have these little containers. And now we're saying, you know what, containers are too much. Let's go down to, to this next evolution of serverless. So it's kind of funny that we keep minimizing it more and more, because really at the end of the day, what we want to do is have highly scalable applications. And so, that's the funny part is that people have to, you and I, we get involved in tech and we love tech. So we're like, hey, let's look at this new shiny object,
right,
and let's see how it works. Let's break it apart. Let's play around with it. But, and a lot of people do that, especially in the cloud native community, because it kind of has that kind of vibe. But really, at the end of the day, when it comes back down to it, what you want to do is say, do you need geolocation? Do you need redundancy? Do you need, scalability? Do you need, all these kinds of things that really you have to look at what the app needs are. And I think that's what people are getting to now.
100%. Yeah. And the whole idea of minimizing more and more is actually very interesting. And when we're thinking about serverless, I think with things like GCP Cloud Run, Gkey Autopilot, Fargate Profiles, Azure Container Apps, whatever else is out there, we're actually getting the idea of what serverless is, or maybe what we all thought it was. So like for example, when it first came out and we were all playing around with, Lambda, for example, in AWS, we were like, oh, this is really cool. The whole idea is we push our code up and that's it. But it wasn't that, right? It ended up being more about event driven applications. So if you had event driven applications, you set up triggers, the triggers were your code, things would kick off. But now we're actually seeing like, oh, okay, this could be serverless. You know what I mean? Like the whole idea around, again, Cloud Run, Autopilot, etc. Oh, it could actually be serverless. So the really cool thing about Cloud Run is you just set up your configuration, your resource optimization. You set up where you want it to run. Do you want it to have multi-AZ? What container image you want it to be, etc. And then you just run it, and it orchestrates and it scales for you. You set up, your min count, your max count, like you would with replicas, with horizontal pod auto scaling and stuff. And it brings the idea of like, okay, serverless could actually be a thing in this space, and even the code base to get it up and running. So if you look at a Terraform configuration for EKS, you're talking 60, 70, 80 lines of code. When you're thinking about GK Autopilot, it's 21 lines of code. I was able to get it down to just 21, like literally a block. And that's it. Why? Because we're not worried about the worker nodes. We're not worried about the control plane. We're not worried about anything. It's really just get an environment up so we can deploy our containers. And that's why I think, that'll be the next thing. Other than the third party add-ons and tools that don't quite work yet on some of those environments.
Now it brings up the question though, do you trust these environments? Because now what you're doing is you're shifting the responsibility from you managing it and you understanding to being this black box that's kind of behind the scenes and somebody else managing all of those things.
Right.
So it becomes, it depends, who do you trust? Do you trust your guys to do it your way, or do you trust the big
Right.
hyperscalers to do it?
Yeah, and I think just like we've always seen, it's going to definitely depend on the environment. So like we've seen it, like when we went from bare metal to virtualization, it was like, do we trust this? When we went from virtualization to the cloud, that was a big conversation, right? It was like, do we trust to put our stuff somewhere that we can't manage it? And I think that conversation will always be had. And I think the answer will be the same as we've always kind of seen it. There's a reason why there's still data centers, right? Well, there's two. One, because people don't want to run their applications in different environments, right? They already have the data centers, they're already paying for it. They need particular performance, or they need particular bandwidth, right? Like we see that a lot with telco. And then the other part of it is, maybe it's a government regulation thing, or maybe it's a compliance regulation where you need to have certain things still in location. Even if we're thinking about federal, the whole idea of Kubernetes at the edge, that helps federal a ton, right? Because they can have different locations where they're setting up clusters, maybe they're bootstrapping with kubeadm, whatever the case may be, and they're running them in different locations. But point being is they must control 100%. And we're most likely always going to have that in some way, shape, or form. But for the organizations that don't need that level of maybe compliance or that level of performance, like the startup that has 5 people, or like the startup that maybe has 100, 200, 300 people, that don't need, a certain level of bandwidth, right? Or whatever it is that's blocking other organizations from being able to fully run 100% in the cloud. So I think it's always going to be a conversation based on where you're working.
Yeah, I mean, it does have its advantages too, because now you're running this code out on the cloud, and if there's stuff that you're executing that needs to be, multi-geography and things like that, then it can be called from applications locally. It can be called from different ways. So really, it comes back down to architecture too. Is do you need this design for a certain way of interaction?
Mhm. Exactly. Yeah. And to your point, people are just putting code up and it's running, right? And that's kind of the beauty of it. And we always wanted that with serverless, but we didn't get it. But we can actually get it now with things like, all the tools that we were just talking about. And the reason why is because we're running our code the same way we have been. So if you're running on Kubernetes right now, right, whether it's a managed Kubernetes service or whether you're bootstrapping on prem or whatever, and you want to look into one of these serverless options, your code base doesn't change. Nothing changes. Your containers don't change, nothing, because it's still running in Kubernetes. It's just a form of Kubernetes that you're not managing. And that's kind of the cool part, is that it really is a lift and shift. I mean, you're not the only thing that may not work, and we were talking about this a little bit before we went live, are the third party tools and add-ons. So like, for example, right now in GKE, you can run Istio, but in Fargate profiles, you can't run Istio. And I think the only one right now that's supported is AWS's version of Service Mesh. So like, those are the little nuances that you're going to have to worry about. But my assumption is at some point that won't be as big of a deal. I think right now we're just kind of seeing it primarily because these providers, really what they're doing with the Kubernetes code base, they're taking the Kubernetes code base and they are revamping it and putting little bells and whistles on to make it work with their core services. That's why when you use AKS, Azure Identity and Azure RBAC work out of the box, right? Versus that Azure RBAC isn't going to work out of the box on Gkey. You can make it work, it just doesn't work out of the box. So once I guess once that's a little bit more centralized in terms of like, the managed Kubernetes services and providers putting, little sprinkles of their own stuff on top, once they kind of open it up a little bit to allow you to put more on top, which will require them to, of course, test, see if it works, et cetera, which it should. I guess it depends on how they've built their own. But once again, they get that piece kind of situated, then we should be good to go from that perspective of the third party tools and add-ons.
Yeah, and a serverless mesh can be a big deal in this environment because if you're thinking about it and you're using something like a serverless, you may want to connect to a traditional Kubernetes cluster for other services, or maybe on-prem, or hybrid, or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
where you want to mesh together all these services, communicate, and that's typical for that environment. So it becomes more of a big deal for something like serverless.
Oh, totally. 100%. Yeah. I mean, we're talking, will all of our GitOps solutions work? Will all of our service mesh solutions work? Will all of our resource optimization solutions work? Will third parties like KubeVirt work, right? If we're running that, implementations like Crossplane, if you're working with cluster API, is that going to work 100%? So yeah, and I think that's really the only thing that's holding us back from it being a reality right now, is the fact that we kind of get the idea of like the third party add-ons and tools working. Once that's good, then I think this will be more of a reality for people to start using. Because to your point, it's a big deal if these third party tools and add-ons that we've been working so hard on to get into our environments are not working. That's obviously going to be a big problem. And the other piece of it is there's a lot of vendor lock-in, right? And I kind of hate the term vendor lock-in, because like people say, oh, if you're using this tool, you're not locked in. No, you are. You're just locked into that tool. There's always some type of lock-in.
Mhm.
But with this serverless Kubernetes stuff, with Fargate profiles, for example, where you can only use the AWS service mesh, that feels a little bit more locky, and a lot of people aren't gonna a lot of people aren't gonna be interested in that.
Yeah, it's funny. People complain about vendor lock-in, but it's fun when you do studies on this stuff. What they care about more is ease of use.
Right.
So it's they say they care about vendor lock-in, but then they'll go in all AWS or all Google or all Microsoft. It doesn't. So
Yep.
it's an interesting topic. But what we do see is that people are more likely to go to a cloud than try and do it themselves these days.
100%. 100%. Yeah, we definitely do still see the on-prem stuff. We can talk about the story of Mercedes running over 1,000 Kubernetes clusters on OpenStack and all that. But The reason why we all know that story is because that there's a finite amount of organizations doing that, at least that we're aware of. Again, when we're looking at federal agencies and we're looking at government agencies, healthcare, perhaps, right? Like heavily compliant needs, there may still be a lot of, well, there are, it's not may, there are still a lot of organizations not running in the cloud. It's just a matter of like who they are, and chances are, due to compliance, we probably don't know a lot about them. Um, so yeah, it really all depends on the organization. And once that's figured out, it's much easier to decide what path they want to go down. And to your point, they want ease of use. So if it's an organization that's like, you know what, I'm already in AWS anyways, who cares if I have to use another AWS service? Because I haven't even implemented service mesh environment in my environment, but I want to. And if I go with Fargate profiles, it's going to make it easier. Fine, who cares? And I think that's why the whole idea of multi-cloud uh, hasn't really exactly taken off in a sense, right? Because a lot of people think it's a cool idea, but at the end of the day, what they really want is multi-AZ.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you see it all the time. I mean, hybrid, I think, has taken off way more than multi-cloud, and I think that makes sense because people want to keep a certain amount of their, applications local and solutions local that they connect to, and that's at a corporate, you know, basis. They kind of figure that out. But in terms of multi-cloud, it's always been a great concept, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort to get that right. And there's different environments, there's different ways of setting it up. To me, I tend to use Google a lot just because I feel like it's a more natural Kubernetes for the way that I'm accustomed to. Not that it's a better service, but it's just a better fit for me because I work with native Kubernetes, and the Google feels more, it feels more similar for me. But if I was to try and do that same thing in Amazon, which I do all the time, but if I was to try and do that without knowing it, it would be a totally different configuration language. It would be, everything would be different. It'd be have different services, different ways to connect, different ways to do VPCs. So it becomes a really, really difficult thing unless you have people that are dedicated to each of those environments.
1,000%. Yeah. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where it's the same code base, but what the cloud vendors do is they take it and they sprinkle some of their stuff on top, for better, for worse, I guess. But yeah, I mean that's the reality. And it's funny, we are in the same boat with the GKE thing. I don't like to pick favorites and sides, but I think Gkey, in my opinion, is the best managed
Yeah.
community service. Even like the security posture that they give you, where you have that on the left pane, there's like that security. I think it's called security context button or something like that, and you see everything right there. You don't have to implement any other tools for CIS and for NVD, and it's like, wow, yeah, that's really cool. I don't see that pain in other managed Kubernetes services.
I mean, it makes sense too because they were the founders of a lot of this technology, so that totally makes sense. But yeah, I mean, the other ones make it a little bit more difficult, or not in the way that I'm accustomed to. So I guess if you weren't accustomed to doing it or setting it up a certain way from like bare metal, all the way up, then it probably wouldn't make a difference. Honestly, it would. It's just a different way of doing it, and that's why I don't say one's better than the other. It's really what you're accustomed to.
Mhm.
I tend to like Google just because that's what I'm accustomed to.
Right. Yeah,
So,
totally makes sense.
but what about one of the things I did want to talk about is, there's this whole concept of supply chain security right now,
Mm.
and it's not that it wasn't a concept before, but it's in the forefront right now. So, what about something like serverless? What do we think about when we think about supply chain security? And are there tools, or can you use the same tools to manage the security of that as you would like a Kubernetes cluster?
Yeah, I mean, I think the good thing is the tools and how we use them, I don't think are going to differ all that much, to be honest with you. Because let's say we're thinking about, all right, so let's say we break it down between cluster security and pod security, right? And we do something like we take the 4 C's of Kubernetes security. We're looking at the cluster, we're looking at the containers, we're looking at the code, we're looking at the cloud. It doesn't change in terms of how the 4 C's are configured. In terms of how we're scanning clusters. So even right now, we're using tools like maybe Kubebench, or we're using tools like Cubescape, or we're using, whatever the other tools are out there that are scanning your clusters and showing you the issues that you're having, where CIS is picking it up and NVD is picking it up and all that. A lot of those issues, and when you look at them, have to do with the control plane, of which you do not manage anyways. So I don't really see a lot of change from the cluster perspective. From the pod perspective, no. I mean, when you look at all the issues that come up, right? Whether it's network policies, whether it's security contexts, whether it's base images that you use in your container images that aren't good or that have vulnerabilities, all that stuff really doesn't have anything to do with the worker nodes. And ironically enough, when you think about it from a security perspective, there's not really a lot you're securing on the worker nodes other than hardening the images, um, maybe the container runtime, which you don't manage really anyways and manage Kubernetes services. So there isn't a lot that you're thinking about from a security perspective. If those worker nodes go away, it's not really a big deal. I mean, I think maybe, if they give you the ability to like implement Talos, which is like the Kubernetes operating system, right? It's a Linux-based distro, but it's minimalized. It has a lot of the built-in CIS security features and stuff. So maybe if they give you an option to deploy, and they might already, I don't even know. I should actually look before I say that. But if they give you an option like that, yeah, maybe it's actually not that big of a deal. Because I think if the worker nodes go away, I mean, other than them being hardened, really not much you have to do.
Yeah, so then it comes back to like, when these companies, big organizations typically have audits, then does the cloud provider have to provide some kind of certification that says um, these nodes are configured a certain way, or, how to, the onus now becomes on them to kind of provide some information back.
100%. Yeah. I mean, just like what we're seeing with managed Kubernetes services right now, they are getting certifications for certain layers of compliance and stuff like that. So, yeah, you're going to have to show that stuff to your auditors. And it's going to be the same thing, with if it's full serverless versus if it's a managed Kubernetes service offering. The cloud's going to have to be able to back that up a little bit in terms of compliance level security. And just like now, if you're in a particular environment where it's like, hey, sorry, they don't meet this compliance need or they can't give us this information, then that means some of your workloads will have to run on-prem. So in reality, it's kind of no different than it is now, which is a good thing. There's not a lot of change, which is good. And if this whole serverless Kubernetes thing ends up being as big as I think it could be, it may be the easiest we've ever seen from shifting from one environment to another, because you're not really shifting environments, which is good. You're just kind of shifting mindset and thought process in terms of what you're managing.
So, but serverless has been around a while, and
Mhm.
so what do you think? I mean, we've talked about tools, we've talked about maybe that, and some of the underlying utilities not working. What do you think is holding it up from being more mainstream? Do you think it's perception? Do you think, and obviously this is opinion, but do you think it's perception of it? Do you think it's how to interact with it? Do you think it's architecture? Is it all the above?
Yeah. So and then, like you said, this is opinion, right? This is totally subjective. Number one, I think serverless got the rap of this is event driven workloads for particular triggers, right? So that's number one. But with like Cloud Run, for example, it's not like that. It is serverless, but it has nothing to do with event driven workloads. There is a piece of it called jobs for event driven workloads, but then there's the other piece of it. It's called services, which is just regular Kubernetes deployments and such. So that's one piece. I think the other piece as well, the third party tools and add-ons that don't work, and the fact that you're so locked in to what the cloud is doing, which doesn't sound like a big deal because like we talked about before, we're already locked in anyways. But the problem becomes we just spent 12 months getting Istio up and running properly, and now you're telling us we can't use it. That doesn't sound worth it, right? Because we just put a lot of time and money into getting this whole thing up and running. I think those are the two heaviest pieces right now for a lot of places. And the other thing too, I talk about this a lot with the whole serverless Kubernetes thing. A lot of people don't know about it. So a lot of people haven't used Autopilot or Fargate profiles or Azure Container Apps because it's still slightly new. I mean, I think Autopilot, if I'm not mistaken, came out 2022, maybe 2021, 2022, something like that. So it's still very new, especially, if it just came out 2, 3 years ago, that means, most enterprise organizations haven't even seen it yet or haven't even thought about it, right? Because they've been working on getting managed Kubernetes service up and running properly, let alone now just shifting to something else.
What do people have to consider when they're designing applications to design for something like this versus, any of the others? Obviously, you said that Kubernetes is the same. So, is are there any other additional considerations when designing for this?
No, I would say the biggest thing is the scale. So when you're looking at Azure Container Apps, if you're looking at Fargate profiles, if you're looking at GKE Autopilot, if you're looking at Cloud Run, make sure you understand the scale. So for example, right now, you can add, just as many worker nodes as you want into your cluster as long as your cloud account doesn't hit quota, right? You're going to have to look for the serverless ones, what the quota will be and how much load you can run, because that will differ based on environment, based on account, etc. But funny enough, I was just at an event last week in California where Google Cloud was presenting on Cloud Run, and I asked the question, "What is the scale?" And they were like, "Honestly, I mean, there's probably some limit, but because it's running on Borg, there's kind of like nobody's hit the limit yet that they know of. There's probably a limit at some point. Like if you want to run 1 million worker nodes, you probably can, but there's but there's some limit there. It's just I don't think people have hit them yet.
So we've talked a lot about the cloud-based versions of these things. Is there an equivalent, privately hosted? I mean, for the event-driven type stuff, there's always been things like OpenFaz and things
Mhm.
like that have been
Yeah.
out there.
Yep.
Or is there an equivalent of this
Mhm.
that's for the private?
Yeah, I would say Knative
Yeah.
is probably the best equivalent right now. And funny enough, if you go into your GCP portal right now and you spin up an instance of Cloud Run, you click around a little bit and you'll see the YAML tab, and you click on that YAML tab, it's Knative running in the back end. So that's kind of how they're doing it. I assume. I don't think, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think you can see the YAML for like Azure Container Apps, and I haven't seen it yet for Fargate. But I'm assuming they're doing something very similar. So yes, something like Knative, for example, would absolutely be the way to do it. There's also the idea of maybe kata containers. I haven't seen this used in production from that perspective, but so for everybody that's listening, kata containers, what they are is, instead of using pods, you're using really, really, really small VMs as pods. Uh, there could be a play there. I haven't seen it done in production for this particular use case, but conceptually and theoretically, I could see a play there as well.
Yeah, micro VMs is another whole thing that people haven't really got into that much yet. But there are several cloud providers that are providing that kind of micro VM. There are CNCF projects around it.
Yeah.
So that could be a whole other conversation is in that area there.
Oh yeah, 1,000%, absolutely, 100%. That's why I was playing with Talos Linux today, and it's the same thing. It's this really small footprint that's incredibly secure and built just to run Kubernetes. It's a distro just to run Kubernetes. So yeah, I mean this that whole idea, and then the idea of like KubeVirt, and can KubeVirt play a role here? I mean, yeah, this is such a huge rabbit hole, and that's why I think this topic is so interesting, and where it can go for organizations is going to change the game. If they don't have to worry about worker nodes anymore, if they're not worrying about worker nodes anymore and they're just worrying about this whole serverless Kubernetes thing, that is now the definition of software defined infrastructure. Like that is the definition. We've hit it. If we can get there, we've hit that.
Yeah, and from a slightly different perspective. WASM was kind of that. People were getting tired with the whole containerization area, and they were like, you know what? We could do this a lot more simple if we use something like WASM. We could just create this stuff. We could listen on it. We can, use gRPC, all these kinds of things.
Yep.
And but what we found is that it's an option. It's not necessarily supplanting things like containers. It's
Right.
just a different option, or it could be the one that's used together too.
Yep. And that's funny, right? It was about 6 months ago or so, maybe 8 months. It was like, this is going to kill Kubernetes. That everybody talked about that for about 3 weeks.
Yep.
Stop talking about it.
Yeah.
Because I was in a couple of conversations where people were like, oh, it's going to kill Kubernetes. I was like, where are you going to orchestrate the WASM workloads?
Yep.
It's not magic here. You still got to orchestrate it in some way. So yeah, and I think that was probably the closest thing to like can we run workloads in other arenas? And I think it's great. Like WASM is a really really good idea, and I love the fact, like from a server side perspective, I love the fact that Mike, you can write in Python, I can write in Go, somebody else can write in Node, and we put it into one place, it compiles into one package, and boom, it's off to the races. So it actually doesn't matter what you're writing in. That's a beautiful thing. But in my opinion, that has nothing to do with dethroning containers or dethroning Kubernetes, right? It's a vertical scale, right? It's not horizontal, or it's a horizontal scale. It's not vertical. Like you're not creating anything new. You're just adding to the plethora of things that we already have.
It's funny because it wasn't a new idea. IIS had that concept, in the early days, and it was called something, I forget what it's called now, but it had that plugin concept where you could create and compile and create all of this stuff. And .NET still has it to
Exactly.
this day.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's something new. They just kind of used that same concept and made it more generalized and called it WASM.
Exactly. Yeah. 100%. 100%. And I think, the best way that we can think about this, right? This whole serverless Kubernetes thing, maybe the WASM stuff, if we fit it in to this realm, for anybody that's used Heroku, I think this could be what Heroku wanted to be. Because Heroku still, right now, is arguably the best way to take code and just run it and not worry about it conceptually, right? There are a lot of things that people are running into with Heroku, because with Heroku, the thing is, the less control you have, the more you have to abide by how they say the world looks. That's why Heroku wasn't where it should have been, unfortunately, right? Because you had to look at the world through their lens. But hopefully, with things like this whole, again, that I don't know if anybody's calling it this, but serverless Kubernetes, hopefully, because it's still the Kubernetes APIs sitting on the back end, right? That's all it is. It's still all the Kubernetes APIs on the back end. You're just looking at it from a software perspective versus an infrastructure perspective, truly. So hopefully, you'll only have to look through the lens of what you're looking through with Kubernetes right now, if the vendors will open it up a little bit to be able to bring your service mesh and bring your GitOps solution and all that jazz.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. It's funny. I don't think anyone's ever talked bad about Heroku. Everybody's like, I want this Heroku type service.
Yes.
Everybody wants that. So it's obviously done a really, really good job
Yeah.
at what it does. And I've never understood why it didn't do better, because of the fact that I've never heard anyone talk bad about it. And most people are like, I want to create a service like Heroku.
100%.
So yeah, so it's interesting. So part of the show, what I do in this part of the show, what I do is I have this area called buzzworthy or buzzworthless. And you can tell me, I'll give you a couple terms and you can tell me whether they're buzzworthy or buzzworthless.
Sure.
And, just give me a couple sentences on why you think so.
Mm-hmm.
So, Kubernetes, is it now buzzworthy or is it buzzworthless?
The good news is I think Kubernetes has become boring now. I think it's been around long enough and in production long enough where it's not the hot new buzzy thing anymore. So I think we're safe there.
What about going into security, shift left? Is that buzzworthy or buzzworthless?
100% Buzzy. The concept was great, right? When engineers created the concept of let's get security in the beginning, spot on. But as soon as the non-technical marketers and salespeople got a hold of it, that's when we went downhill with shift left.
That's typically the way. I mean, it's I mean, the same thing's happening right now with AI. Generative AI. I mean, it has its great promise
Mhm.
of doing stuff, but people are just connecting it to their toasters and saying, "Is my toast done yet?" Yes, your toast is done. Okay, is it brown or is it?
Right.
So that's not probably the best use for it. So if you use things in the proper way, it's great. But when you have architecture that just says, "Hey, yeah, we do AI," no, not really.
And that's the unfortunate reality right now, right? For anybody listening that has built data sets, built data models, trained those models, and sent them to particular experiments, when they hear Gen AI, it's almost like, right?
Yep.
Because the whole promise of Gen AI from a technical perspective is we don't have to have all these models train all of our stuff anymore. These LLMs, they can just go out and train themselves. Guess what? They need to train themselves on data. That data
Hmm.
needs to exist. That's why we see things like, what was it, a couple of weeks ago, Gemini, where it pulled the data from Reddit and it was telling people to
Yeah.
glue their cheese on the pizza to make it not slide.
Yeah.
This is for everybody who thinks Gen AI is going to take their jobs. We're not there. We're not even close.
No, it's funny because people are like, "Well, you have all this data on the internet. Have you seen the internet? Do you really want to train it on all that data?"
That's the ironic part about it is, they're like, well, all these LLMs, they're just going to go out to the internet and train themselves.
Yeah, maybe not.
I don't want no. I don't think so. I mean, maybe it will, but it won't train it the right way. Eventually, what's going to end up happening is we will have to put some type of guardrail on what data LLMs can consume. Like,
Yeah,
for example, probably shouldn't be consuming data from Reddit, right? Like,
yeah.
that's doesn't really make any sense. So eventually, we will have to put some guardrail and some blockers and some
Which they do.
QoS,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, that's the whole thing. I mean, I had the guy that he was the head of technology for the TII, which has Falcon
Mm.
um, AI, and he was telling me that the filters are more important than the data. So yes, you need good data, but you also need appropriately good filters and training and things like that. So
100%. Yeah.
so yeah, good.
Oh no, and I was just gonna say, I'm actually focusing a lot on AI and ML right now, but not the
Me
Gen AI
too.
buzzy stuff. Yeah, like I'm doing a lot with the AI working group and at CNCF. So I'm putting together a lot of the pieces around Kubeflow, and Kubeflow is a way to train your data on Kubernetes. So I'm way in the back end of doing the AI and ML stuff, from the back end engineering piece. So I'm not really in the front, the Gen AI buzzy stuff, but I am
Yeah.
in the back of it building how this is all going to look later. And it's very interesting. Like
Yep.
if for everybody that's listening, if you've never looked at tools like TensorFlow or PyTorch or even Kubeflow, right? Like if you're interested in the Kubernetes realm, build a data set. And it could be something simple like take 5 of your favorite cars and put the
Yeah.
year, make, model, color, engine, right? 5 of them, turn that into a data model, build some other data sets, put them in the same data model, learn the training mechanisms and the experiments behind it. It's actually very interesting and it's very cool to see how data is captured and how data is learned upon.
Yep.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, I agree. So anything to leave people with for the show? Anything that is top of mind that you want people to get out of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two biggest things for me right now are, the serverless Kubernetes stuff and the security stuff. This weekend I wrote a ton of content collectively, like over 5,000 words of blog posts around security in the Kubernetes realm. That's very, very interesting. So look at the 4 Cs of Kubernetes. And if you need a place to start, the KCSA. You don't have to get the certification if you just look at the objectives and kind of learn from there. It's a really, really good place to start. And if you're feeling adventurous, go look at the exam objectives for the CKS. Again, you don't have to take the exam, but if you just learn the stuff, very, very good. Very, very cool stuff as well, and very, very important to know in any production environment. So Kubernetes security, serverless Kubernetes, and then the whole AI and ML Kubernetes stuff as well. So those are the three things for me.
Well, thanks so much for coming on. This is always a joy to have you on and to collaborate with you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate it.